The grand hall shimmered under warm golden lights. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen stars, reflecting soft glows across polished marble floors. Rows of velvet chairs were arranged neatly before a shining black grand piano placed at the center of the stage. The air carried a mix of perfume, fresh flowers, and quiet excitement. It was a night people had been waiting for. The event was a charity concert organized by some of the most respected people in the city. Wealthy guests, music lovers, business owners, and reporters filled the hall. Everyone had come to see the famous pianist perform live. His name alone was enough to sell every ticket within days. People admired not only his skill but also his confidence and charm on stage. Behind the curtains and away from the spotlight, the staff moved quickly and quietly. Waiters carried silver trays filled with sparkling drinks. Coordinators checked guest lists. Technicians adjusted microphones and lighting. Among them was a woman dressed in a simple uniform, carefully balancing a tray of glasses as she walked between guests. Her steps were steady, her face calm, and her presence almost invisible. She had worked at many events like this before. She knew how to blend into the background. Smile politely, keep moving, never interrupt important conversations, never draw attention. It was easier that way, but tonight felt different to her. Every time she passed near the stage, her eyes drifted toward the piano. The polished surface reflected the lights so brightly that it almost looked alive. She tried not to stare too long, but something inside her pulled her attention back again and again. Music had once been a big part of her life. Years ago, when she was much younger, she had spent hours sitting in front of a piano just like that one. Her fingers had moved across the keys with confidence and joy. She had learned classical pieces, practiced scales until her wrists ached, and dreamed of performing in halls just like this. Life, however, had other plans. Family responsibilities came suddenly and heavily. Financial struggles made it impossible to continue lessons. Slowly, the piano in her life became quiet. Then it disappeared completely. What remained were memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. A burst of applause filled the hall as the famous pianist walked onto the stage. The woman paused near a table, careful not to block anyone's view. The crowd rose to their feet in respect. Cameras flashed. The pianist bowed slightly, smiling with the ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times. He carried himself with confidence. His tailored suit fit perfectly. His movements were relaxed but controlled. When he sat at the piano, the room instantly fell silent. The first piece began softly. His fingers moved smoothly, and the music flowed like a gentle river. The audience leaned in, completely focused. Every note echoed clearly through the hall. Some guests closed their eyes to feel the music more deeply. The woman stood still for a moment longer than she should have. The melody touched something old inside her. She quickly blinked and reminded herself to keep working. There were tables to attend to and guests to serve. As the performance continued, the mood in the room grew lighter. The pianist was not only talented but also playful. Between pieces, he shared small jokes and stories about his travels. The audience laughed easily. He knew how to entertain. During a short break, he stood up from the bench and stretched his fingers dramatically. Even pianos need to rest, he joked into the microphone, earning warm laughter. While the audience chuckled, the woman walked toward the stage area to place a fresh bottle of water on a small side table. She moved carefully, keeping her head slightly lowered out of habit. As she stepped away, the pianist noticed her lingering glance at the piano. It was only a second, but he saw it. With a playful spark in his eyes, he spoke into the microphone again. "You there?" he called lightly, pointing in her direction. The spotlight operator, thinking it was part of the show, accidentally let a beam of light drift toward her. The woman froze. The crowd turned to look. Some people smiled, expecting another joke. She felt her cheeks warm under the sudden attention. "Yes, you," he continued with a grin. "You seem interested in the piano. Would you like to play something for us?" Laughter rippled through the hall. It was friendly laughter, not cruel, but it still made her heart race. She shook her head slightly and gave a polite smile, hoping he would let it go. She tried to step back into the shadows. But the pianist leaned forward, clearly amused. "Come on," he said. "Just a few notes. We promise we won't judge." The audience laughed again. Some guests even clapped softly, encouraging her as if it were harmless fun. Inside, her thoughts were racing. She hadn't touched a piano in years. What if her fingers froze? What if she forgot everything? What if the crowd laughed harder once she made a mistake? But beneath the fear was something else. A quiet voice whispered that this might be the only chance she would ever have again. Her hands felt slightly shaky as she placed the empty tray on a nearby table. She could feel hundreds of eyes watching her. The hall that once felt warm now seemed too bright. The pianist stepped aside from the bench, still smiling confidently. He gestured toward the seat as if presenting a gift. "Please," he said lightly, "let's see what you've got." For a moment she considered refusing again. It would be easy to laugh and return to work. Everyone would forget within minutes. But she didn't move away. Instead, she took a slow breath. The sound of her shoes on the stage floor felt louder than it should have. Each step seemed to echo in her ears. The spotlight followed her now, fully exposing her simple uniform against the elegant setting. She sat down carefully on the piano bench. The smooth leather felt unfamiliar. The keys gleamed under the lights. Up close, the piano looked even more beautiful. Her fingers hovered above the keys, not touching yet. She could feel her heartbeat in her palms. The hall grew quieter. The laughter faded. The audience sensed that something unexpected might happen. The pianist stood nearby with folded arms, still wearing an amused expression, though now there was also curiosity in his eyes. She closed her eyes for just a second. Memories rushed back. Long afternoons practicing in a small room. A teacher correcting her posture gently. The sound of her younger self laughing after mastering a difficult passage. Her fingers slowly lowered onto the keys. At first, she pressed one soft note. It rang out clearly across the hall. The sound was pure and steady. She pressed another, then another. The notes were careful but controlled. Not random, not hesitant. The pianist's smile began to fade slightly, replaced by interest. The woman inhaled deeply and allowed her hands to move more freely. A simple melody began to form. It was quiet, almost fragile, but it carried feeling. The notes flowed into each other naturally, like they had been waiting patiently all these years. The audience leaned forward. No one laughed now. The staff near the back stopped moving. The hall that had once been filled with chatter was now wrapped in stillness. Her fingers moved more confidently with each second. Muscle memory returned like an old friend. The melody grew stronger, richer, more emotional. She was no longer thinking about the crowd. She was no longer thinking about fear. She was simply playing. And in that moment, something inside her that had been silent for years began to wake up. The first few notes hung gently in the air, soft but steady. The woman could still feel the warmth of the spotlight on her face, but it no longer burned the way it had a few seconds earlier. Her hands were no longer shaking. They were remembering. The melody she played was simple at first, almost like she was testing the waters. She let each note breathe before moving to the next. The hall remained completely silent. Even the faint clinking of glasses had stopped. The famous pianist stood just a few steps away, watching closely now. His playful smile had slowly disappeared. In its place was a thoughtful expression. He had expected awkward noise, maybe a few random keys pressed out of nervousness. Instead, he was hearing something structured, something intentional. The woman opened her eyes and looked at the keyboard. The black and white keys no longer felt foreign. They felt familiar, like something she had known deeply once. Her fingers moved a little faster. The melody began to take shape. It was not one of the popular pieces people often performed to impress others. It was something older, something she had once practiced over and over again in a small room many years ago. It carried a quiet sadness, but also strength. In the audience, a woman in the front row leaned forward slightly. A man who had been checking his phone lowered it slowly. A few people exchanged surprised glances. The staff members at the back of the hall stood still. Some of them knew her as the quiet worker who rarely spoke beyond polite greetings. They had no idea she could play like this. As the melody continued, her breathing slowed. She was no longer aware of the crowd in the same way. The noise in her mind faded. There was only the piano and the music. The famous pianist crossed his arms, but this time not in amusement. He tilted his head slightly, listening carefully. He could hear proper technique in her playing. The way her wrists lifted gently. The way her fingers curved naturally. This was not someone pressing keys by accident. This was someone trained. The melody grew deeper. Her left hand joined more strongly now, adding soft harmony beneath the main tune. The sound filled the hall with warmth. It was not loud or dramatic, but it carried emotion. Inside her heart, memories began to rise clearly. She remembered the old upright piano that once stood near a small window in her childhood home. It was slightly out of tune, but she had loved it anyway. She remembered practicing late in the evening after finishing her schoolwork. She remembered how her family used to sit quietly and listen, even when they were tired. But she also remembered the day everything changed. Her father had fallen ill suddenly. Hospital visits became frequent. Bills began to pile up. Her music lessons were the first thing to stop. "We can continue later," her teacher had said kindly. But later never came. Soon, she found herself working part-time to help at home. Then full-time. The piano at home was eventually sold to cover expenses. She tried not to cry when it was taken away. She told herself it was just an instrument. Life was more important. Years passed. Responsibilities grew. Music slowly became something she kept only in her thoughts. As these memories flowed through her, her playing grew stronger. The melody shifted into a more powerful section. Her fingers moved faster now, but still controlled. There was feeling in every note. The audience felt it. A man in the second row swallowed hard. An older woman pressed her hand gently against her chest. No one expected this depth from someone who had walked onto the stage wearing a simple staff uniform. The famous pianist stepped a little closer to the piano, drawn by curiosity. He watched her hands carefully. There was discipline in her movements. Even after years away, the foundation of her training was still there. He realized something important in that moment. This was not luck. This was not a joke anymore. The woman allowed the melody to soften again. She slowed the pace slightly, letting the notes stretch out like a quiet confession. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply telling her story the only way she knew how. Each note carried a piece of her past. The lost lessons, the silent evenings, the dreams she had folded away like old letters. The hall felt different now. The bright lights seemed softer. The air felt heavier, not with pressure, but with emotion. At the back of the room, one of the event organizers wiped at the corner of her eye without realizing it. A waiter who had worked beside the woman for years stared at her with open surprise. The famous pianist felt something shift inside himself as well. He had played in grand theaters across the world. He had received standing ovations and awards. But this felt different. There was honesty in this music. No performance tricks. No dramatic gestures. Just truth. The woman's shoulders relaxed further. She no longer felt small or invisible. For these few minutes she felt seen, not because of the spotlight, but because of the sound flowing from beneath her fingers. She reached the middle section of the piece, where the melody rose gently before falling again. It was the part she had once struggled with during her training. She remembered practicing it again and again until her hands finally understood it. Now, without thinking too much, she played it smoothly. A soft murmur of amazement moved through the audience. The famous pianist slowly lowered his arms. He looked at her not as a staff member, not as part of the background, but as a musician. The music swelled slightly, not in volume alone but in feeling. It was as if years of silence were being poured into these few minutes. She pressed the keys with quiet strength, then eased back into softness. The contrast made the melody even more powerful. Somewhere in the crowd, a man removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. A young girl sitting beside her mother stared at the stage with wide eyes, completely still. The woman herself felt a small ache in her chest. But it was not pain. It was release. She had not realized how much she missed this. How much of herself she had tucked away. The final section of the melody approached slowly. She knew it well. It ended not with dramatic force, but with gentle resolution. Her fingers began to slow. Each note lingered slightly longer than the one before. The hall was so quiet that even her breathing could almost be heard. She played the final few notes carefully, letting them fade naturally into silence. Her hands remained on the keys for a second after the sound disappeared. No one moved. No one clapped immediately. It was as if the audience needed a moment to return to the present. The famous pianist stood beside her, his expression no longer playful at all. There was respect in his eyes now. The silence stretched for a heartbeat longer. And then, somewhere near the front, a pair of hands began to clap slowly. Another joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted into applause, louder than before, but this time different. It was not polite appreciation. It was genuine. The woman slowly lifted her hands from the piano and looked up. She seemed almost surprised. She had not expected this reaction. She had not even planned to play more than a few notes. The famous pianist stepped forward slightly, still clapping. He nodded at her, not joking now, but acknowledging her skill. She stood carefully from the bench, her heart pounding again, but for a very different reason. The applause continued, strong and steady. For the first time in many years, she felt something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. The applause did not stop quickly. It rolled through the hall like a wave, strong and full of feeling. The woman stood beside the piano, her hands resting gently against the side of the instrument. She was not used to being the center of attention. Her heart was beating fast again, but this time it was not fear. It was something warmer, something almost unreal. She looked toward the audience and saw faces that were no longer amused or curious. They were moved. Some people were still clapping while wiping their eyes. Others simply stared at her in disbelief. The famous pianist stepped closer to her. For a brief moment, they looked at each other without speaking. His expression had completely changed. The light, playful tone from earlier was gone. In its place was quiet respect. He leaned toward the microphone slowly. The applause softened but did not fully fade. "I did not expect that," he said honestly. A small ripple of laughter passed through the crowd, but it was gentle. No one felt like laughing loudly anymore. He turned toward her. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The question echoed softly through the speakers. The spotlight still rested on both of them. She hesitated. Speaking in front of so many people felt harder than playing. She had not prepared for questions. She had not prepared for any of this. "I used to take lessons," she said quietly, her voice steady but soft. "A long time ago." The hall remained silent, listening carefully. The pianist nodded slowly. "A long time ago," he repeated, as if thinking about what that meant. "You play like someone who never truly stopped." She lowered her eyes slightly. "Life became busy," she replied simply. There was something in the way she said it that needed no further explanation. Many in the audience understood that feeling. Dreams set aside, responsibilities taking over, choices made out of necessity. The pianist looked at the piano, then back at her. "Would you play something else?" he asked. The audience gasped lightly, surprised by the request. She blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Another piece?" He nodded. "Yes, anything you want." For a second, doubt returned. The first performance had come from memory and emotion. It had surprised even her. But playing again meant she could not hide behind chance. It meant expectation. The hall waited. She took a slow breath and looked at the keys once more. Something inside her told her not to walk away too quickly. This moment might not come again. She sat down at the bench once more. The applause faded into complete silence again. This time she did not start as slowly. Her hands found the keys with more confidence. She began with a softer introduction, different from the first melody. This one was brighter, but still emotional. The famous pianist stepped slightly back, giving her space. His arms were no longer folded. He stood with his hands gently clasped in front of him, fully focused. As she played, the music carried a different feeling. It was not only about loss. It held strength. It felt like a quiet conversation between her past and her present. The audience listened even more closely than before. Her fingers moved with natural grace. Even the small pauses between phrases felt meaningful. She allowed the music to rise gently, then settle. Felt alive. Halfway through the piece, something unexpected happened. The famous pianist slowly walked toward the second piano that had been placed near the back of the stage for decoration. It had not been planned for use that evening. Most people had forgotten it was even there. Without interrupting her, he sat down quietly. A soft murmur moved through the audience. He waited for the right moment, listening carefully to her rhythm. Then, very gently, he placed his fingers on the keys and added a soft harmony beneath her melody. The sound blended smoothly. She looked up in surprise but did not stop playing. Their eyes met for a brief second, and he gave a small nod, as if asking permission through music instead of words. She responded the only way she knew how, by continuing. Now the stage held not a joke, not a challenge, but a duet. The hall felt electric. His playing was refined and confident, polished by years of experience on world stages. Hers carried raw emotion and quiet strength. Together, the sound became something deeper than either alone. The audience watched in complete awe. There was no competition between them, no attempt to outshine. It felt like a conversation built on respect. She adjusted slightly to his rhythm, and he adjusted to hers. The balance formed naturally. For the first time that evening, the famous pianist smiled again. But this smile was different. It was not playful. It was inspired. As the duet continued, the music grew fuller. It filled every corner of the hall. The chandeliers above seemed to shimmer along with the melody. The woman felt a surge of energy she had not felt in years. Playing beside someone so skilled might have once made her nervous. But now, instead of fear, she felt connection. Her hands no longer trembled at all. The audience could sense that something rare was happening. This was not rehearsed. This was not scripted. It was honest and alive. The piece reached its most powerful moment. Their notes rose together, strong but controlled. Then slowly, they softened again, guiding the melody toward its end. The final notes were played in perfect harmony. When the last sound faded, silence fell once more. But this silence felt different from before. It was deeper, heavier, filled with emotion. Then the applause came again. This time it was louder than anything earlier that night. People stood to their feet. The woman remained seated for a second, almost overwhelmed. She looked out at the crowd, trying to understand what was happening. The famous pianist stood up and walked toward her. He extended his hand to help her rise from the bench. She accepted it. They stepped forward together toward the front of the stage. The audience continued clapping, some even cheering softly. The pianist leaned toward the microphone again. "Tonight," he said slowly, "we were reminded that talent does not disappear. It waits." The words settled gently over the crowd. He turned slightly toward her. "Thank you for reminding us." She swallowed hard, unsure what to say. "I only played what I remembered," she replied honestly. "And that was more than enough," he answered. The applause continued for several long moments before finally calming. As she prepared to step off the stage, the pianist gently stopped her. "Please," he said quietly so only she could hear. "Stay for the rest of the evening." She looked at him, confused. "As a guest," he added. Her eyes widened slightly. She glanced down at her simple uniform, then back at the audience. "I'm working," she whispered. He gave a small smile. "Not anymore. Not tonight." Behind them, the event organizers were already nodding in agreement, moved by what had just happened. For the first time in many years, she did not feel invisible. She stepped back from the microphone, still unsure if this was real. But as she looked out at the crowd one more time, she understood something important. This was no longer a joke. This was the beginning of something she had once believed was over. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling in the room did not disappear. It stayed in the air like a soft echo. The woman stood near the edge of the stage, unsure of where to look or what to do next. Just an hour ago, she had been moving quietly between tables with a tray in her hands. Now hundreds of people were still watching her with admiration. One of the event organizers hurried toward the stage, whispering something to the famous pianist. He nodded calmly and then turned back to her. "You're not going back to work tonight," he said gently. "Please sit in the front row. Enjoy the rest of the concert." She hesitated, felt strange. Her co-workers were still standing along the walls, holding trays, doing their jobs. She had always been one of them, blending in, not standing out. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said quietly. "You didn't," he replied. "You created something beautiful." There was no pressure in his voice now, only sincerity. After a brief pause, she gave a small nod. One of the staff members quickly brought her a simple shawl to place over her uniform, so she would feel more comfortable sitting among the guests. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. She walked carefully down from the stage and took a seat in the front row, still trying to understand how her evening had changed so quickly. The concert resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. The famous pianist returned to the piano and began another piece. His playing was as skilled as always, but something in it felt softer, more thoughtful. Several times during his performance, his eyes drifted toward her. Not in a dramatic way, just a quiet acknowledgement. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, listening deeply. Now that she was in the audience, she could fully feel the music without thinking about trays or schedules. It had been years since she had sat in a concert hall simply to listen. The music stirred emotions she had kept hidden. Not regret exactly, more like longing mixed with gratitude. She was grateful for the chance to touch the piano again. Even if nothing more happened after tonight, she would carry that memory forever. When the concert finally came to an end, the crowd stood once more for a final ovation. The pianist bowed deeply. This time, before leaving the stage, he turned toward her seat and gestured gently for her to stand. The audience followed his gaze. She felt her face grow warm again, but she stood. The applause shifted toward her once more. It wasn't as loud as before, but it was steady and respectful. After the curtain closed, guests slowly began moving toward the exit. Many paused near her seat. "You were incredible," one woman said softly. "I had no idea," another added. A middle-aged man leaned slightly closer. "You should never stop playing again." Each comment felt unreal. She thanked them politely, still feeling like she might wake up from a dream. Backstage, the famous pianist waited near the dressing room. When she approached, he dismissed the assistants with a small nod so they could speak privately. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "You trained seriously," he began, not as a question but as a statement. "Yes," she answered. "For many years." "What happened?" She took a slow breath. It was not a story she shared often. "My father became ill. We needed money. Lessons stopped. Then work became more important. I thought I would return to it one day, but—" She gave a small shrug. "But life moved forward," he finished gently. She nodded. He walked over to a chair and sat down, motioning for her to do the same. "Do you still practice?" he asked. She shook her head lightly. "There is no piano at home. I haven't played in years. Tonight was the first time." He looked genuinely surprised. "Years?" "Yes." He leaned back slightly, processing that. "That means what we heard tonight was not just training," he said slowly. "It was memory and heart." She lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond to praise. He studied her face for a moment, as if making a decision. "Would you be willing to meet again tomorrow?" he asked. Her head lifted quickly. "Why?" "I would like to hear you play in a quieter space. No audience. No pressure." She hesitated. "I have work. I can speak to the event organizers," he said calmly. "They would understand." This felt overwhelming. She had responsibilities, bills, routine. The idea of stepping into a different world, even briefly, made her nervous. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. He nodded. "That's fair." He stood and walked toward a small table where a notebook lay. He wrote something down and tore the page carefully. "This is the address of the rehearsal studio I'm using while I'm in the city," he said, handing her the paper. 10 in the morning. No obligation. Just come if you want to. She looked at the paper in her hand. The address felt heavy. "I'm not promising anything," she said softly. "I'm not asking for a promise," he replied. There was no pressure in his voice, only opportunity. As she left the hall later that night, the cool air outside felt different against her skin. The city lights shimmered around her. Cars passed by, unaware of what had happened inside the concert hall. She walked slowly toward the bus stop, holding her small bag tightly. Her mind replayed the evening over and over. The spotlight, the first note, the duet, the applause, and now the invitation. When she reached home, her small apartment felt as it always had, quiet and modest. She placed the piece of paper on the table and stared at it for a long time. Part of her felt afraid to hope. What if tomorrow led to disappointment? What if tonight had simply been a beautiful accident? But another part of her, the part that had awakened at the piano, felt alive again. She barely slept. The next morning, sunlight filtered through her window earlier than usual. She sat up slowly, glancing at the table. The paper was still there. Her heart began to beat faster. She stood, walked over, and picked it up again. 10 in the morning. She looked at the clock. There was still time. For several minutes, she stood frozen in the middle of her small living room, thinking about everything she had built in her life. Steady work, responsibility, stability. Then she thought about the way her hands had felt on the keys. Without allowing herself too much time to doubt, she changed into simple but neat clothes and left the apartment. The rehearsal studio was located in a quieter part of the city. When she arrived, she almost turned back. The building looked professional and intimidating. But before she could lose her courage, the door opened. He was already there, waiting. "I'm glad you came," he said simply. She stepped inside. The room was smaller than the concert hall but filled with natural light. A grand piano stood near the window. "No audience today," he said with a faint smile. "Just music." She walked toward the piano slowly. This time there was no spotlight, no laughter, no surprise, only possibility. The rehearsal studio felt quiet in a different way than the concert hall. There were no chandeliers, no rows of velvet chairs, no soft whispers from a crowd. The room was simple. Sunlight poured in through tall windows, touching the wooden floor and resting gently on the grand piano in the center. She stood near the door for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. It did not feel heavy, felt honest. The famous pianist closed the door behind her and walked toward the piano. "Take your time," he said. "There's no rush." She nodded and moved closer to the instrument. Up close, she could see small marks on the wood from years of use. This piano was not just for display. It had been played often. She ran her fingers lightly across the edge of the keys without pressing them. The cool surface sent a small wave of memory through her. He did not sit beside her this time. Instead, he pulled up a chair a short distance away. "I want to listen," he explained, "not perform." She sat on the bench slowly. Without the noise of an audience, she could hear her own breathing clearly. Her heart was steady but strong. "What would you like me to play?" she asked. "Something that feels true to you," he answered. She thought for a moment. Then she placed her hands on the keys and began with a gentle scale, warming up quietly. The notes filled the room in a soft, clear way. There was no microphone, no echo from high ceilings, just pure sound. After a few minutes, she moved into a piece she remembered practicing in her teenage years. It was more complex than what she had played at the concert. Her fingers hesitated once or twice, but she did not stop. She adjusted and continued. He watched carefully, not interrupting. When she finished, the room remained still for a second. "You still have control," he said thoughtfully. Your technique is sleeping, not gone. She let out a small breath she didn't realize she was holding. I feel slower, she admitted. That's normal, he replied. Muscles need training again, but the important part is still there. He stood and walked toward the piano. May I? She moved slightly to give him space on the bench. He sat beside her and played a short, simple phrase. Repeat this, he said gently. She did. Again. She repeated it, smoother this time. They continued like that for nearly an hour. Small exercises. Simple passages. Nothing dramatic. No pressure. Just rebuilding confidence. At one point, she stopped and looked at him. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. He paused before answering. Because talent like yours should not disappear, he said. And because last night reminded me of something important. What was that? That music is not about fame. It's about truth. She looked down at her hands. I'm not sure I belong in your world, she said honestly. He smiled slightly. Music is not my world. It belongs to anyone who feels it. His words stayed with her. Over the next few days, she returned to the studio each morning. The organizers of the event had given her time off after hearing about what happened. Her co-workers had surprised her with encouragement instead of jealousy. Each session brought small improvements. Her fingers grew stronger, her timing sharper. Mistakes became fewer. But it was not only about skill. It was about belief. One afternoon, after a long practice, he closed the piano lid gently. There is something I want to ask you, he said. She looked at him carefully. I have another performance in 3 weeks. A smaller hall. Not as grand as the last one. I would like you to open the concert. Her breath caught in her throat. Open it? She repeated. Yes. She stood up slowly from the bench and began pacing a little. That's different from last time. Last time was an accident. This would not be an accident, he said calmly. It would be a decision. Fear tried to rise again. What if I disappoint everyone? She asked. You won't, he replied simply. You can't know that. I can, he said, meeting her eyes. Because I've seen what happens when you forget the audience and just play. She stopped pacing. This would mean people expect something, she said. Yes, that's what scares me. He nodded. Fear does not mean stop. Sometimes it means step forward carefully. She sat back down, quiet. 3 weeks. It sounded both close and far away. What if I say no? She asked. Then nothing changes, he answered gently. You go back to work. You keep playing in private if you wish. There is no shame in that. She thought about her small apartment, the quiet evenings, the steady routine. Then she thought about the way her heart felt when she played. I need time, she said. Take it, he replied. That night, she walked home slowly again, just like after the first concert. But this time, she was not holding a piece of paper. She was holding a choice. When she entered her apartment, she sat at the small kitchen table and closed her eyes. She imagined standing on stage again, not as a surprise, not as a joke, but as someone invited. Her hands trembled slightly at the thought. She also imagined saying no, staying safe, staying hidden. That image felt heavier. The next morning, she arrived at the studio earlier than usual. He looked up from his notes when she entered. Well? He asked softly. She took a slow breath. I'll do it, she said. His face broke into a genuine smile. Good, he replied. Then we begin properly. The days that followed were different from the earlier practice sessions. Now there was direction, structure, purpose. They chose a piece together. It was emotional but strong, challenging but not impossible. He guided her through difficult sections patiently. When she became frustrated, he reminded her to pause instead of forcing progress. You are not proving anything, he told her one afternoon. You are sharing something. Those words eased the pressure inside her. As the concert date approached, small posters began appearing around the city. Her name was printed in smaller letters beneath his, but it was there. Seeing it for the first time made her heart race. This was real. On the final rehearsal before the concert, She played the full piece without stopping. When the last note faded, the room felt charged. He did not clap immediately. He simply nodded slowly. "You're ready," he said. She was not sure if she felt ready, but she felt stronger than before. That night, as she prepared for the upcoming performance, she stood in front of the mirror in her small bedroom. She was still the same woman, the same quiet worker, but now there was something else in her eyes. Not fear, not doubt, courage. The evening of the concert arrived faster than she expected. The hall was smaller than the first one, but it was still beautiful. Soft golden lights lit the stage. Rows of seats stretched out in front of the piano. The air carried that familiar mix of excitement and quiet whispers before a performance begins. Backstage, she stood near the curtain, her hands gently clasped together. She was not wearing a staff uniform this time. She wore a simple, elegant dress that made her feel both nervous and proud. It was not expensive, but it was chosen carefully. When she looked down at herself, she felt like she was stepping into a new chapter of her life. The famous pianist stood beside her. He looked calm as always, but when he turned toward her, his expression was warm and steady. "Remember," he said softly, "you are not here to impress anyone. You are here to tell your story." She nodded. Her heart was beating fast, but it was different from the first night. That night had been surprise and shock. Tonight was choice. The host stepped onto the stage and welcomed the audience. There was polite applause. Then the introduction came. "And now, please welcome a special guest who will open tonight's concert." Her name followed. Hearing it spoken into a microphone made everything feel real. The applause began, gentle but welcoming. She took one slow breath and stepped onto the stage. The lights felt bright, but not blinding. She walked carefully toward the piano. Each step felt steady. She did not rush. When she reached the bench, she paused for just a second and looked out at the audience. Faces watched her with curiosity, not doubt. Some people had heard about the unexpected moment at the earlier event. Others were simply here for music. She sat down. The hall grew quiet. Her hands rested lightly above the keys. She closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to center herself. She remembered the small apartment, the early mornings at the studio, the first note she had played weeks ago. Then she began. The opening was soft and delicate. The melody moved gently through the hall, almost like a whisper. She allowed the music to breathe, not rushing the pace. Her fingers felt strong. The weeks of practice showed in her control. When she reached the first challenging section, she did not tense. She trusted her hands. The sound grew fuller. In the audience, people leaned forward slightly. There was something honest in her playing. It was not flashy. It was not dramatic for the sake of attention. It was sincere. She felt the connection almost immediately, the quiet energy that flows between a performer and listeners when both are present in the moment. As the piece moved into a stronger passage, her confidence grew. Her back straightened slightly. Her hands moved with purpose. The famous pianist stood backstage, listening carefully. He did not look worried. He looked proud. The melody carried emotion, but it also carried strength now. Not just the sadness of lost years, but the courage of returning. In the middle of the piece, there was a brief pause written into the music. A moment of stillness before the next rise. She let that pause exist fully. The silence in the hall felt deep and respectful. Then she continued, pressing into the next phrase with gentle power. A woman in the third row closed her eyes. A young boy sitting near the aisle stared at the stage without blinking. An older man slowly wiped at the corner of his eye. The music told a story without words. It spoke of quiet sacrifice, of hidden dreams, of second chances. When she reached the final section, she felt a calm she had never felt before on stage. Not fear, not doubt, belonging. Her hands slowed naturally as the piece approached its end. The final notes were soft but clear. She held the last tone gently, letting it fade into the hall. Then silence. For one long second no one moved. And then the applause began. It was not explosive at first. It grew slowly, building into something strong and steady. People stood to their feet one by one. She opened her eyes fully and looked out at them. This time she did not look surprised. She looked grateful. She stood from the bench and gave a small bow. The applause continued. When she stepped off the stage, the famous pianist met her with a quiet smile. "You did not just play," he said softly. "You arrived." She felt tears in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of release. Later that evening, after he performed his own set and the concert ended, several people approached her backstage. Some offered kind words. One small music school owner handed her a card and said, "If you ever wish to teach, our doors are open." Another guest spoke about arranging a community performance. Opportunities she had never imagined were suddenly standing in front of her. But what mattered most was not the offers. It was the feeling inside her. A few days later, she returned to her apartment after the excitement had settled. The city outside moved as it always had. Buses passed. Neighbors chatted. Nothing looked different, yet everything felt different. In the corner of her small living room now stood something new. The piano. It was not the largest or most expensive instrument, but it was hers. The famous pianist had helped arrange it quietly, saying only that every musician deserves a place to practice. She ran her fingers across the keys gently. This time, she did not wait for a spotlight. She sat down and began to play, filling her own home with music. Weeks passed. She balanced work and music carefully at first. Then gradually, music began to take more space in her life. She gave small performances at community centers. She taught a few children basic lessons in the evenings. She did not chase fame. She did not need grand halls every night. What she wanted was connection. One afternoon, as she guided a young student through simple scales, she noticed the same spark in the child's eyes that she once had. "Don't stop," she said gently. "Even if life becomes busy, keep a small space for music." The child nodded seriously. Sometimes she thought back to that first night. The joke, the laughter, the unexpected invitation. If she had walked away, none of this would have happened. The famous pianist continued his world tours, but he often mentioned her story in interviews. Not as a dramatic tale, but as a reminder that talent can live quietly in ordinary places. And she continued building her life with steady courage. One evening, months later, she stood again on a stage, this time at a local community hall filled with families and neighbors. It was not glamorous. The seats were simple, the lighting modest, but as she played, she felt the same truth. Music was never about the size of the audience. It was about honesty. When she finished that performance, the applause felt just as meaningful as it had in the grand halls. Because this time she understood something clearly. She had not just returned to music. She had returned to herself.